Hello and welcome to this evening's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith, featuring Elinor Lipman discussing her new book, Rachel to the Rescue, in conversation with Stacy Schiff. Live captions have been enabled for this event. If you'd like to view the captions, you can find the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom window, or if your screen is not maximized, click the More button at the bottom of your screen to find it in the menu. These transcriptions are automatically generated, and I will drop this information in the chat for folks to reference. Well, my name is Bonnie, and I'm a bookseller at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Massachusetts. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. If this is the first time you're hearing about us, welcome. It's very nice to meet you. We're happy to have all of you join our community this evening, and we really appreciate your support of Elinor's work and an independent bookstore through your purchases and attendance. The chat and question box are open, so feel free to make use of those. Remember to set your chat to all panelists and attendees if you'd like to chat with others in the audience. Please drop your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window so they're not lost in the chat. And please note that Brookline Booksmith has a strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at our discretion, any attendee can be removed from an event for such behavior. Now for the fun part. I'd love to start by introducing our moderator, Stacy Schiff. Stacy was the editor of Elinor's first two books, so we really couldn't have a better conversation partner for this evening. She is a former Guggenheim Fellow and received a Pulitzer Prize for her book, Vera, Mrs. Vladimir Nabokov. She is the author most recently of Cleopatra, A Life, and The Witches, Salem, 1692. Schiff's brilliant and compelling nonfiction writing has been lauded in the New York Times, The Guardian, and the Wall Street Journal, among others. So thank you, Stacy, so much for being here. And now to introduce our author. Elinor Lipman was born in Massachusetts and now splits her time between Manhattan and upstate New York. A fun fact that I just learned is that Elinor was actually Brookline Booksmith's first ever author event. So it's lovely to have you back. Of course, 13 books later. Elinor's first novel, Then She Found Me, was published in 1990 and adapted into a film starring Helen Hutt, Bette Midler, and Colin Firth. She won the New England Book Award in 2001, and her novel, My Latest Grievance, won the Patterson Fiction Prize. She was also a finalist for Nicholas Kristof's Donald Trump Poetry Contest in the New York Times. Her writing has been featured in the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. She is the author of one short story collection, a book of poetry, and a memoir, as well as 13 novels, the most recent, of course, being Rachel to the Rescue. Rachel to the Rescue was praised in the New York Times as an entertaining romp of a political satire. Rachel Klein is sacked from her job at the White House after she sends an email criticizing Donald Trump. As she's escorted off the premises, she's hit by a speeding car. With a quirky ensemble of characters, Rachel to the Rescue moves along at a quick and comical clip while Rachel deals with the chaos unfolding around her and learns to find happiness for herself. Lipman's writing is full of wit and insightful inspection of society, and Rachel to the Rescue offers a humorous and heartwarming look at how we all journey through the messiness in our own lives. It is a pleasure to have you both here tonight to discuss Rachel to the Rescue. Thank you, Elinor and Stacy, for being here.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Thanks for having us, Bonnie. The lovely introductions. Elinor Lipman, I realized as I was about to get online tonight that I have known you more than half my life and we have never done a book event together.
That you're right. You're definitely right about the math there. And is that possible?
Really a little shaky. So that's good.
You know, we did not to contradict you, but I did introduce you at an event when you were getting one of your many awards.
That's not a book event, but anyway.
Okay. All right. I am corrected. Okay.
But we have much to talk about. So more than with most novels, you clearly had to do quite a bit of research with this one. So without spoiling anything, I wonder if we could talk just a little bit about Rachel's job description. And then maybe you might want to speak to the question of how you seem to know so much about various White House protocols.
Oh, well, we'll discuss the research. Did I or didn't I? But the moment I decided to make Rachel's job in the White House Office of Records Management, which is truly the anachronism is WORM, WHORM, for real. It was, I had it in me that I was going to write a novel about someone who was fired from the Trump White House. Don't ask me why, except for my political obsession and watching the news starting at 6 in the morning. And I didn't even question it. It was like, that's the next novel. But I didn't know what her job would be, what she would be fired from. So I had a bad idea. I had two bad ideas. One that had to do with a kind of, sort of consultant in the kitchen, specifically for Melania's special diets. Thought that had some comic possibilities. Or the other one, I think the first one, even worse, was that she would have been a tutor for the unnamed Trump child that you're not supposed to name. But one morning, I was reading Politico Playbook, and it said, the lead article, I think, was about someone who quit the White House Office of Records Management, where the job there was singly to Scotch tape back all of the papers, memos, documents, emails that Trump ripped up. So I said, that's it. That's the job that my character had. And I didn't know anything more than that, except she would be fired from that. Good riddance to that job, but there we go.
Because it had to be an ex-White House person, right? It couldn't be a
current. Don't ask me why, though. Okay. Oh, because I'd have to know too much.
Right, okay.
I'd have to really work there, really for verisimilitude, and, what I couldn't provide that. But you flatter me with the research. The one phone call, no, that sounds terrible. The one phone call I made was I needed to get Melania, the fictional Melania, this is a novel, I had to get her from Washington to parts unknown. So in the first draft of just the chapter, I had her jump into the car and drive. So I thought, that's probably not what the First Lady can do. So I did a blind call to the Secret Service. And I left a message and I said that I was a novelist, so I wouldn't sound like an assassin. And could someone call me about this protocol? And some very nice man did within a few hours. And I wrote his name down, and because I said I would send him a book. Of course, he can't provide an address. So it would be sort of, nice man, care of the Secret Service. But he said that he really couldn't tell me exactly what the protocol was. But if I watched the movie called Guarding Tess with Shirley MacLaine and Nicolas Cage, I would get a very good idea of the amount of coverage and security around the First Lady's movements. So I did that. So there we have it.
I love when you call someone to do nonfiction research and they turn you to a fictional source. I mean, that just makes perfect sense, right? But you also have her stop somewhere on that trip, right?
Oh, for real, I myself, having gone to a festival, a literary festival in Gaithersburg, Maryland, stopped myself at the Joseph R. Biden Jr. Welcome Center. So he had not been, when I was writing this, he wasn't even the nominee yet, but I thought, what a good place to have Melania P. But the Biden Welcome Center, that was just a lucky break.
That was very lucky break. So the first chapter, your first 3 pages are they're loaded. I mean, in the first 3 pages, Rachel gets a job. Actually, she gets 2 jobs. She gets a security clearance. She loses the job, and then she's knocked out, as Bonnie's already mentioned, by this big black car driven by what the papers call a personal friend of the president's outside the executive office building. So I've known you to start a novel at a place that winds up later in the book. But in this case, did the novel always open with the accident? And did you have a sense that you wanted us to get off on this flying start, that you had just had this sort of action-packed, kind of, crazy turbocharged first couple of pages? Is that intentional?
The way it happened was I wrote about her getting fired. She sent a kind of a drunken email to what she thought was her best friend in the department. And because it was sort of following a general email about sort of refrigerator etiquette in the office, she replied all, and, you know, it got her in trouble and she got fired. So I got that far. I described where she came from, the jobs leading up to this. And then I said, and then I had her out on the street, and I thought, well, she gets hit by a car.
Of course.
And I didn't know even who was driving it yet. I didn't know that. So it wasn't me I do it very much seat of the pants. And that was, I think, a good example. We should reassure people that we're not going to go through this 3 pages at a time.
Well, you know, but it's just that
the entire book.
So I don't think anyone's worried about that. So much happens in those 3 pages. I mean, it's literally, there is not a line. I looked at it again, which is why I know this. There's not a line in which something doesn't happen in those first 3 pages. Anyway, at several points, moving along, you literally put words in Trump's mouth.
I do.
And Tucker Carlson's mouth, for that matter. So I'm thinking in particular of several uproariously funny lines in which Trump talks about bats and bat flu and bat rabies and bats bumping up against walls, and how he likely would speak foreign languages better than Melania if only he had lived abroad too, given his Ivy League background. Do you crack yourself up, and did you crack yourself up writing that part? Because you seem to have you seem to have given him, you seem to be having more fun with him as you go.
You know, people ask me that all the time, if I laugh when I'm writing it. And the answer is always no. That, you know, I just, that particular scene where he's being interviewed on Fox, which I don't watch, but I did look at, I couldn't even bring myself, sorry, I don't want to offend anyone in the audience who's a big fan of Fox or Donald Trump for that matter. But I read transcripts of Tucker Carlson's shows, and, you know, it's just sort of the way I do it. I just try to, you know, I try to get it right. And, you know, I knew that it would be, you know, lighthearted, and I knew other people would find that funny, I hoped, but I don't laugh out loud. It's very, very rare that I, like, you know, emit a little chuckle.
So it's just the rest of us who are kind of spitting at the page, in other words. You have to admit the bats is particular, you know, I mean, you didn't get a pangolin in there, but you got the bats. So that was pretty, you know.
Well, I was trying there to just do, you know, extreme Trump, extreme ridiculousness, and getting things wrong. So he was getting the medical part of it wrong, and he was getting, you know, so it was fun, you know. And of course, all the poems I used to write were all from the point of view of Donald Trump. So I had about 4 years experience of writing from the Donald Trump point of view.
I'm glad it came in handy. Did anyone warn you that you might be heading into dangerous territory?
No. 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 It's funny because whenever I discuss this with, you know, the people in power, agent, over the course of my writing this book, I had my current editor, current then editor, left for another job, and her replacement, this was at Houghton Mifflin, left for another job. And then the new editor came in, and everybody was wonderful. And I told them all what I was writing about, and they all, you know, thought it was great without having read anything. So yeah, you know, that happened.
Yeah,
and then people were worried that people wouldn't want to laugh at Donald Trump.
And do you think that do you think that the book does read differently now that we read it during a different administration?
No, I mean, I think it would be the same. I know that when, you know, it first came out, when my English publisher editor read it, he wanted to bring it out. He brought it out right away, and he brought it up. The pub date was the American election on November 3rd. And so I feel that the people who read it before the new American edition came out, they would write me and say that it was a relief, a tonic. I think Stacy Schiff called it a palliative because she's a wonderful vocabulary.
You have to admit, I mean, it felt that way, but I also wonder if you worried, putting Trump on the page, is there some feeling of this isn't a proper form of entertainment and a proper way to approach him, but also does he overwhelm the story? And did he, I mean, I've had this problem with non-fictional characters where somebody is so quotable or so looms so large, they overwhelm the rest of the cast. And you didn't seem to have any problem confining him to his correct place in the narrative, right?
Well, because he's really not in it that much. He's discussed, but the actual voice of Donald Trump, I think I had a little more fun with Melania, getting her dressed and putting her on a date and things like that. So, he was certainly there in the background. To me, I think part of my answer should be, I lived with Donald Trump, from the time he came down the balcony and said that Mexicans were rapists. He launched himself in my head, rent-free, as they say. And so to me, it was like, yeah, I live with Donald Trump. Of course I think that's why it had to be a novel about him, sort of about him.
Sort of about him. But I mean, the rest of us were all sort of speculating about the Trump marriage, and you were actually writing about the Trump marriage.
This is true. Right? Yeah, this is true. And maybe it'll all come true like the Biden Welcome Center.
I'm trying to think what else you predicted in this novel that we would all
Mar-a-Lago, direct, like take off to Mar-a-Lago. That wasn't a really brilliant prediction, though, I have to say.
But sort of to finish with that subject, or half finished with that subject, is it harder to satirize someone who doesn't have a sense of humor?
No.
Okay, so it would have been, either way, you would
easier. I would say easier. Yeah, easier.
From the beginning, it's always been about food in your pages. And I can still wax rhapsodic about Frankie's soup. It's the first story, right?
Actually, we should take a little detour here to say that, this is going to be a little testimonial. I'll embarrass Stacy, but people sometimes can annoy an author by saying, oh, you've been lucky. You've been so lucky. And you like to think, well, I like to think that I had these books published because people liked them and that they were good enough and, all that stuff. But the luckiest break I had in my career is that my then late agent submitted a group of stories to Stacy Schiff at Viking. And it was a miracle because within the manuscript, there were 3 connected short stories about characters named Tim and Hannah. And she sort of sent it back, but she also said she'd like to talk to me about the possibility of making more stories about those characters. And we had a phone conversation, and she said, how many more could you write? And I said, well, how many do you want? And she said, how about a total of 7? And I said, yeah, sure. And I thought, well, I'll have to write them, and then she'll take them to an editorial committee, and they'll get shot down. She's sort of a junior editor, weren't you? Kind of a junior editor at the time. But you had the faith that you bought them on the strength of my promise. So there we have it. And Stacy still reads every chapter as I write it.
Well, I was going to say, if I may now embarrass you in turn, there were a few lucky breaks for me in there. One of them being I was like baby editor, and I found this fabulous writer whom I was so excited about. And secondly, I got an editor for life out of the deal. I mean, you read every page that as it comes out of the typewriter dripping wet. So, and sometimes you even send it back and say this isn't working, which is
I never did that. But once I said it was hard because I hope we're not boring people, because I always call myself, every conversation we have about a chapter, the unwashed reader. I'm not a historian. So I will say sometimes, I think you could make that sentence a little simpler. That's about the harshest criticism. And once in a while, because I'm a little more comma prone than you are.
You're a little more comma prone than I am, but I do like you as the unwashed masses. You also, I think, told me in one of those conversations that I should start brushing my hair. So I'm also very grateful to you for that. I brushed my hair for tonight. Now,
she's lying. I never said that. Okay.
to get back to where we were. So food. So Frankie's soup,
yeah.
that's the first story in that first collection, right? Okay, so I still think about that soup and I don't even know, why is it pink? Is it red cabbage? What's the recipe for Frankie's soup?
It was actually, I had this meal and it was, it was a friend, my late husband was in medical school. No, what was he? Was he in medical school? No, we weren't married then. Anyway, it was a colleague, a fellow resident, and he was Japanese. And he made this beautiful clear pink soup. And it was just the red cabbage and some red onion that was put in just for the color. So obviously I never forgot that.
Understandable. Anyway, that was one of the things that made me first fall in love with your work, 30 years ago. But what I really want to ask is, Yasmin in this novel in the kitchen all the time. There's so much cooking in this book. I mean, it's like you were running a test kitchen or something while you were writing this book. There are all those chickens. What was it? Just we needed to have this food as part of Rachel's life? Is it that you were quarantined, so you were in the kitchen a lot? There's always a lot of food in Eleanor Lipman books.
Well, part of it is I feel that you can characterize people with food. I once had an old boyfriend in college, and I was invited to his mother's house for dinner with another college age friend, and she served us liver. Now, I happen to like liver, but let's face it. I mean, did that say a lot about her and her, let's say, hospitality or her?
What does that say about her, Eleanor Lipman?
Well, I think it said that she was clueless, that you don't, because I remember one or two of the guests, just cut the liver, not even chicken liver, it was calf's liver. And so I felt that it showed that she was clueless. So I can use it because, the difference between kind of, arugula versus, I don't know what, coleslaw from the deli. It says something about someone's interest in food. And, I don't want to say it goes any deeper than that. But with Rachel, had been in a kind of, she had one roommate and she was kind of cold. And luckily that rather cold roommate, Elizabeth, took up with Yasmin, who was just very warm and hospitable and loved to cook. And it was always including her. And so, and I don't know, there's at least one Seder in there.
I think I don't know, there are a lot of holidays.
There's Thanksgiving.
Oh, that's right. But you're reminding me suddenly, and I'd forgotten this, there's that someone in this novel is invited to dinner and in advance of dinner submits a list of things to which she's allergic.
Yes.
And I mean, it's a line that just makes one completely crack up, because that's exactly what happens now when you invite someone to dinner and you get the dietary restrictions and it's a page long. Yeah, so I appreciated that hugely.
Yes, I know, I couldn't resist. Social satire of the food variety.
Oh, well, that's right. You also should maybe talk about growing up in a no condiment household, because I wonder if that's where some of this comes from.
Well, yes, my mother had a condiment phobia. So I grew up, we had no, and it goes beyond the usual condiments, because besides ketchup, mustard, mayonnaise, relish, any form of them, she wouldn't, even though she would eat oil and she would eat vinegar, she wouldn't eat salad dressing and mixture together. And yeah, and I remember when my son was about maybe 10 years old, and he was sitting in the kitchen with my mother and saying, Nana, tell me what is in here that you won't eat, condensed tomatoes, corn syrup, and was reading the ingredients, but it didn't make any sense. And she wasn't even raised in a house like that, because her sister used to eat everything and told me that my mother had to sort of sit at a different table. But I made a character. I made the mother in The Way Men Act have a condiment phobia. And I added a couple of, other mishigas that she indulged in.
Well, you lead me to the next question, which is that one of the great delights of an Eleanor Lipman novel are always the ancillary characters. And in this case, it's not just Dougie or Yasmin or Shoshana, but it's that the unnamed woman in the liquor store who looks at our protagonists. I mean, I don't want to spoil anything here, but there's just this delicious moment with a woman who doesn't even have a name, who just kind of puts two and two together when she sees a budding romance. So do those things turn up as you're going, or do you know, do those characters just sort of show up and introduce themselves?
They show up. They show up. And, you know, I remember watching a million years ago a Dick Cavett show, and Dr. O was on, and someone said, and Dick Cavett said, now, how did you decide to have Houdini and Emma Goldman in the book? And he said, well, my character was just sitting in a chair, and there was a knock at the door, and he answered the door, and it was, you know, Emma Goldman or Houdini. And I thought, I just was starting writing that, and I thought, you know, that's what happens. And it's funny you should mention that woman, that character who shows up once. It's because of you that I push myself, because as we said, she reads every chapter, that I don't describe enough, that I will have two characters carry on a conversation. They get together. I don't say what they're wearing or what they look like or anything like that. And Stacy will say, you know, please, I'm dying to know, give me one element, or, you know, does she, you know, so when I put the alligator pocketbook on the woman's wrist, even though she was pushing a walker, that was because I knew, you know, you would like that.
And I was going to scribble in the margin and say, could you please give this woman something to carry with her walker, right?
Well, my favorite editorial comment in margin ever was yours. And it was dialogue. It was in Isabel's bed. And Stacy was not the editor of that book. Maybe you were on maternity leave. You were on maternity leave, maybe. No, you weren't. No, someone else was. But it was dialogue. And you wrote in the margin, could someone here please pass the potatoes?
And naturally you came up with an alligator bag and a walker or something else completely, right? But it is, I mean, it is interesting because you are able to tell you are able to do with dialogue what most fiction writers will do with description, right? I mean, the dialogue really is the backbone of most of the books.
This is true. I will exceed that.
Is that something that, I mean, that's always been true, right? Is that,
yes.
And you have an amazing ear for dialogue, obviously, in both on the page and in real life. I mean, I've never heard you forget a good conversation you overheard at the next table in a restaurant. But is there a marked commitment to that is the best way to portray character? I mean, is that just sort of that's how you're putting these people on the page?
Yeah, it's the easiest part for me, dialogue. And in an early draft, you know, it might be almost all dialogue. And then I look at it, and when I say an early draft, I mean of that chapter, because I rewrite the chapters probably 20 times before I move on to the next one, and until I feel I can't polish it anymore. So the first scribblings for that chapter is probably dialogue, and then I say, I better say what they're wearing, I better say where they're sitting, I better say, you know, what vessel their food is on. And so it comes easy, and then I have to push myself to do exposition and to do dialogue. Not dialogue, description.
It's funny because the dialogue is the part that seems to trip most people up. There's one other glorious merger of fiction and nonfiction in the book when you get to a crossing of, there's another tearing up of pages, which most of the rest of us remember because it happens in a very public forum. Obviously, is that after you had started working on the book, and is that sheerly accidental that there is this parallel with the tearing up of pages between?
Well, you know, I think you can say that because it's not a spoiler, but I have my character watching the State of the Union address, so it was almost sort of live watching that. Probably that had happened a month before I reached that point in the novel.
Have there been memorable emails from readers? What's the response been like
Well, one of the first ones was a woman writing me from Washington, D.C. saying, "Oh my God, you get all the Washington details right." I was so relieved because before COVID, I was planning to take the train to Washington and figure out who could take me around and could see, you know, the office where she worked was in Georgetown, and figure out the subway stops, thanks to your middle daughter who helped me with the subway stops remotely. Oh, so that was a wonderful thing. It was like, phew, I thought I was going to go hang around a wallpaper and paint store, Epstein's in New York, to get some verisimilitude other than my own visits to the wallpaper store, and big trip to Washington, checked everything. So I had to say to people, which way does the traffic go on 17th, whatever it is in the book, it's right in the book, which way does the traffic go, and in front of the executive office building and subways. So I had to do that remotely. But another, and then I'll stop at another favorite email was my character, Rachel, on a date, is at a jazz club, and all the sandwiches were named after jazz stars. And I got an email from a woman who she's the administrator of some Ella Fitzgerald Foundation, and she was so happy to see a sandwich named after Ella Fitzgerald. And the other one was, I got an email from the head of WORM, White House Office of Records Management. Yeah.
That is fabulous.
Yeah, I did. A happy one, yeah.
Put WORM on the map?
He didn't say that, but he, you know, said nice things, and I couldn't believe it. I mean, yeah. So,
have you heard from any other members of the administration?
No, I'm hoping I'll get sued by Donald Trump, though, because that'll be fun. He'll have to be deposed. We'll go to court together, and it'll probably get me on Morning Joe, don't you think?
Yeah, I also think you can get a memoir out of it. Right? Enough of this fiction.
They'll say no. They'll say no. We'd like a memoir review, but like too much, you know, Trump fatigue. We don't want that. Yeah.
Trump fatigue, exactly. So prize-winning jacket design, cover design. You have to admit, it's brilliant.
The British
and the brilliant title. So do you want?
I should say his name. Wait, where's my book? Hold on. Here it is. I should say the name of the designer for all designers to know. Let's see. The designer is, hold on. My glasses. Ifan, it's probably not pronounced that way because it's probably Irish or Scottish. Bates, Ifan, Bates. And he turned that around in a day. And the only thing I asked was that he had a car hitting in front of the White House, hitting Rachel. And I said it was more sort of a bigger car, what's it called? You know, a van sort of thing. Yeah.
And what about, and so that was the British jacket, which was used in the American edition as well, right? Because
the only thing is that in the British edition, my name is italic to match the other British editions of the other books, Good Riddance and Turpentine Lane, and the American ones, they made the cover, they made the text Roman straight, and I think it's the way it should be.
And what about, do you want to tell us where the title, because the title is equally brilliant. Do you want to just give us a little?
I will. I knew I wanted, I'm big on alliteration, and I didn't have the title. I wanted, one of the things I kept trying out on people was, because it's such a political term, was Rachel Redacted, which, you know, I think has its merits. And I can't tell you the number of people who said, well, I know what it means, but other people know what that means. So sitting down one day with Jonathan, the partner, who's a good ear and eye for these things, he said, I came up with a few titles, and there was the Post-it note, which is on the refrigerator, which was something with Rachel, and the third one was Rachel to the Rescue. And I said, yeah, that's it. And luckily, you know, the powers that be went along with that.
So I feel like Rachel comes to our rescue because as I've said, palliative care here, because we so needed this, you know, to get through past the last few days. But but how did you actually mean it? Or how did he mean it, since he came up with the title? Or, I mean,
You know, if I'm being perfectly honest, it was just, I love the title. I love the alliteration. And when people ask, see, from now on, I'm going to say that. It came out at a time where, you know, we were all, you know, just sort of gnashing our teeth. And so I'd like to say, you know, immodestly, that maybe this book could, you know, rescue you from your, you know, your like Trump nerves. But I think Rachel rescued herself. You know, the arc of the story is, you know, it's still a romantic comedy. And not to say that that cures all, but, you know, it's got a happy ending. And I think she rescued Kirby Champion, her lame boss.
did you know that Kirby was going to be I mean, when Kirby first enters the scene, it's unclear to us, even though we know it's an Eleanor Lipman novel, we're not really sure we're going to take to Kirby. We're not sure if Kirby's
Right.
going to be a boar and a handful and a pig, or whether we're going to take to him. Was that your initial reaction to him as well, or did you always know what you had? I mean, I know you never really know what you have in store, but did you have a sort of a mixed reaction to him as well?
You know, at first, I wanted it to be a crazy interview where it's almost, you know, she says, what is this? You know, she said, oh, I finally caught on. This is like improv. And so that's Rachel's internal thinking. And so I was just sort of having fun with that. And then she goes home and tells her roommates about it. And slowly he evolved. She realized that this guy was no talent. He had these books about presidents, but he was a hack, but he was a nice hack. And I had a little fun that he was very, very self-conscious about any kind of hashtag Me Too. So if he ever mentioned anything about his private life or asked her anything, he would always sort of back into it or lead into it with an apology. And, you know, he's lonely and, you know, he invites himself to Thanksgiving dinner.
I mean, he becomes this very lovable lug despite the odds. I mean, that's what's extraordinary, is he does have all these incredibly awkward Me Too moments, and somehow we end up cheering for him, right? Very quickly, which, you know, is a sort of magical feat on your part.
Well, thank you. She finds out pretty fast that this book called The Blight, that is going to be his second Trump book, isn't written yet, and that she's pretty much going to be transcribing his telephone calls with not such great sources and kind of turning it into the book herself. So, you know, that's, yeah.
Did you worry at any point that that events were going to in some way either overtake you or undermine you? I mean, you predict a divorce that I think we all intended to be predicting, but differently. Did you worry in any way that that something was going to happen before the book came out, in terms of current events, that was going to in some way steal your thunder or make it feel dated in some way?
I probably should have worried about that, but that really didn't happen. That there was, you know, kind of Trump divorce that stole my thunder in the book. So no, see, doesn't it sound like I'm just this happy warrior? I don't worry about, you know, how it'll be received, if anyone will publish it. I just couldn't help myself. And yeah, it was just had to write it.
But that's precisely as it should be, right? And was it palliative for you too? I mean, in that respect, in the sense that you had to get through those years, teeth gritted and you know, and writing poetry still.
Yeah, right? I would say so. Yes, it was. Yes.
Is there someone? I'm assuming that you read a whole pile of the books that induced the Trump fatigue.
You know, I did. I read two of the Michael Wolff books, and I might have been mildly inspired by not Michael Wolff, but the fact that Michael Wolff was criticized as not being as historical, academic, that possibly, you know, some of the charges were that, you know, his sources weren't that accurate. And I think that planted a little seed about Kirby Champion. I don't think I answered your question though.
No, but that's an interesting one. So there was a sense there of Kirby not really doing what his job is meant to be.
Oh, completely. Yes, because it's more fun to have him just be a well-meaning buffoon, because she gets hired. She's got a resume where she was fired from the Trump White House, and he saw that as a plus because he didn't want some, Trump accolade to be working on his novel called The Blight. So he saw that. So finally, she gets a job that is, that was a plus.
I don't know why, but the scene in which he hires her, and I no longer remember the line, but it's something about a rat's ass is in the line, is one of the funniest scenes in the entire book.
Oh,
Do you remember the line?
It doesn't sound like something, because I'm not, that's sort of,
It's
maybe someone, my character, Rachel wouldn't have said that, but maybe
he says it.
Yeah, probably didn't give a rat's ass about the fact that he was fired. Yeah.
It's hackerism at its finest, basically.
Okay.
And it's perfectly articulated. So
yes.
I just wanted to ask you one more sort of Trump-related question, and then we probably should turn things over to the audience. But I was thinking about Charlie Chaplin, The Great Dictator, a movie that he said he could never have made if he'd known how bad things truly were. This was decades later that he says that, and wondering if there's a point where like things are indeed too serious and too awful ever to be satirized. And did that ever trip you up? And do you think we know how bad things really were?
I would have. I don't make fun of, sort of things that should be taken seriously, and I just never took him seriously, and I felt that he deserved all the ridicule, even though we've just said the whole book isn't about Trump at all. He has a few walk-ons. That no, I didn't worry about just, I don't know whatever you asked me. I didn't worry about that.
And I'm going to sneak in one more question before I let you go to anyone else's questions. The parents in this novel. It's such an incredibly lovely parent-child marriage, first of all, parent-child relationship. Rachel's so clearly both at ease with them and knows how to work them. How does the magic of that? I mean, is it just like you know what a happy family's like, and somehow you're able to put a happy family on the page and not make us bored to tears since they're happy in their own way? I mean, how do you do that?
Thank you. I think I identified. I think I was her mother, and I was inside Rachel's head. It's first person. I think I was both Rachel and her mother, and I grew up in a very functional family, and it just seemed the way, she's the first time you meet the parents, they've rushed to Washington because they get the world's worst phone call that the daughter is unconscious in a Washington hospital. And, I related. There's probably a little of my mother in there. They're definitely very attentive. They're attentive Jewish parents who are trying to be a little cooler than they are.
But she's also an attentive Jewish daughter who's able to make her own way, despite the not quite hovering attentive Jewish parents. I mean, it's so delicately drawn and so beautifully done. So I just wondered if there was a model for that magic. That's all.
I think I answered that. Did I answer that? Yeah.
Bonnie, do you want to do listener questions? Shall I hand that over to you?
Oh,
absolutely. I'd love to ask some questions from our audience. Just a reminder to all the attendees, if you have any questions for Eleanor, feel free to hit the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom window, and you can submit questions for Eleanor to answer, either about the book or her writing process, or anything you'd like to hear. But you did talk a little bit about a little bit about how Trump plays a role, right, in this book, but he's not a main character. He's sort of like a walk-on. And Marky Knowles asked if you considered using Romana Clee instead of Trump's actual name.
Good question. I did not. It's just like, he just lived in my head. I would say that a couple of editors posed that question. Like, would it work to be either another, a fictional president, or possibly this could be a company and this was a CEO with all the bad habits. But, I just I couldn't drop him.
For sure. He does have that sort of mythos around him that I think invites fictionalization. Megan asked that you said that you liked the alliteration of the title. So how did you come up with the name Rachel? And is it hard after writing 13 novels to find new names?
It is. I called her something else for a couple of pages, maybe even a couple of chapters, but I can't remember what that was because, those drafts disappear. And then Rachel Klein seemed like a good name. And I hadn't yet had a first person narrator named Rachel, but it's hard. And I looked through baby name books and obituaries and my high school yearbook.
That's a great, very clever resource, high school yearbook. I wouldn't have thought of that, but I like to think of just flipping through and picking one. That's nice. Another audience member asked what you're working on next.
I am 200 and today I hit page 230, I think, of a new novel, and it has a name. It's called Ms. Demeanor, MS, Ms. Demeanor. And my character my narrator, once again, is on house arrest in a Midtown New York apartment building for, not a very serious crime, but because she's a lawyer, they sort of made an example of her. And her very accommodating doorman clues her into the fact that there's another tenant in the building who also, he's noticed, has an ankle monitor. So there we have two people in the building. Yeah.
Interesting. That's a very sort of meet cute scenario, or chaos could unfold depending on how you decide to play it. I actually also have a few questions for you myself, if it's okay if I go ahead and ask those. So finding out, I actually didn't know until entering this discussion that the White House Office of Records Management is like a real acronym. And I think that the fact that it is pronounced worm and it sort of, reads that way on the page adds to the humor. I was just curious if you had any more sort of true to life facts that you felt you could integrate into the novel that added humor to the satire.
Let me see, that was my starting off point. And I'll just say about that one thing, that people, even though it begins with an epigraph, which comes right from Politico, which talks about the people who left that office and why, and clued me in about the Scotch tape team. Then, so the first thing I did when the book got accepted right away, well, not so right away, but by my British publisher, the first thing I wanted to be sure was that the office still existed, and it does. So I don't think Joe Biden rips things up, but I think it's White House Office of Records Management. Everything goes to the to the National Records. Stacy, what's that called? You live there.
The National Archives.
Thank you. the National Archives. Yeah.
I live there, actually. That's my home address. Thank you.
Yes. No, I thank in the acknowledgements the Archivist of the United States, who's the one that told me where this office was located and a few other facts, and had me sign a book for the head of Worm. And but he used to be, I know him because he was just a Massachusetts librarian and lived in Topsfield, or was that right? And was it MIT? So what?
That's
Danvers,
lovely.
No, not Amherst.
Danvers.
Oh, Danvers, thank you. I had the Duxbury, yeah, Danvers, thank you. And went from there to the New York Public Library, the #2 spot, and then, Duke, et cetera, et cetera. I won't bore you with that, but very handy person to know.
Yes, absolutely. It's always convenient to be able to speak with people firsthand rather than having to, read through Wikipedia to learn whatever it is you're looking for. Another audience question, Pamela Roth asked, what has changed about your writing over the years? Have you changed as a writer, 13 novels into your career?
I don't know, maybe Stacy should answer that. She reads every page. I don't, do you think I've changed?
Such a good question. Wow. I think the trademark Lipman style, if I may call it that, is pretty unchanged in some of the ways we talked about, in the sense that you use dialogue you write dialogue which is unlike anybody else. It can only be Eleanor Lipman dialogue. And most of the action strangely comes through the dialogue. That's partly why I asked you about the first chapter here, because it's very propulsive and very, not crowded, but very moment heavy in a way which is unusual for you, because usually you let us linger a little bit longer.
Yeah.
No
growth, no development.
Well, I was going to say the mastery was there from the beginning, so you can look at it.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah,
that's lovely. Yes. I don't think we've talked enough. Well, there are more questions because I don't think we've talked enough about the depth of our friendship. Stacy,
does the writing style, does the process change? Because I think that's really the question.
No. Well, first of all, see, she doesn't want me to say nice things about her. Stacy officiated at my son and daughter-in-law's wedding.
Oh, that's so kind. That's so lovely.
Yes, it was brilliant.
It was for any officiating anyone needs to have done.
You already have that license? Is that
a license thanks to your son and daughter? Exactly.
Yeah.
The process of writing changed in some way, though, for you, I think was the real question.
The process. It used to be for the first 2 books, with my first novel, I should say, Then She Found Me, I didn't know. It was my first novel. Do I know how to write a novel? Will this be a novel? Will anyone buy it, publish it? So I just made my way get to the end. And then when I crossed the finish line, I read it, put the pages into 3 piles of the good, the bad, the ugly, what needed to be thrown away, what needed to be revised, what could be saved. And for the second book, The Wayman Act, I also went to the end. And then starting with Isabel's Bed, I decided to go chapter by chapter, polish, and then move on. And I really feel, I mostly have a finished book, except I have to go back and still fix the inconsistencies. And, there's some ball I threw up in the air that I forgot to bring down.
Absolutely. That makes sense. Another audience question, was it daunting or sort of incumbent upon you to address the previous administration through your fiction?
Oh, the previous administration, meaning Donald Trump?
Yeah,
because I don't think they're talking about Barack Obama. I was driven. I just had to. I lived with it. I watched the news starting at 6 a.m. I read everything, subscribed to the Washington Post and the New York Times. And so I had to exercise him, I think. He deserves it. Yeah, he does.
Strong but appropriate word, I think. I like how you said earlier he was living in your head rent-free, as they say. Another audience question. So initially your book was published, or you submitted your book to an American publisher, and then it became published by a British publisher. And this attendee is curious about sort of that American publisher's response now that you have this book out in the world? It's doing so well. Do you think that they regret it, or do you think the British publisher was perhaps a more appropriate setting for this very American-centered book?
Well, I think that I couldn't resist, the editor in England read it in a day and said, I'm doing this. And, I checked with my agent here and my agent there, and it was sure. And I've been with Houghton Mifflin for, I think this is my 7th book with Houghton Mifflin, and I didn't want to leave. And I was just so happy that even though it brought it out in England, and I remember the date, December 19th, when I heard that Houghton Mifflin was going to bring it out in the States. And, and it's been fun.
Amazing. Megan Marshall, a question for you, Stacy. Has your writing as a biographer been influenced by a deep engagement with fiction, like how you and Eleanor, read each other's books, or even other works of fiction?
Well, first, that's such a sweet question, Megan Marshall. First of all, I think I have the best editor in the business, right? So that already is a help right there. The problem when you write what Megan and I write is that you can't really use dialogue unless you have an actual transcript of it or actual evidence of it. So biographies are often dialogue free unless they're, lying to the reader. So I think that's one of the reasons I'm so enchanted by what Ellie's able to do with dialogue, because it's sort of off limits to the rest of us. I mean, it's like this, secret trip that the nonfiction writer or the biographer never really gets to take. And I like to think something of, Eleanor's wit and good humor has rubbed off on me somewhere along the line. And also her productivity. That would be a real boon to my publisher.
Well, she's being very modest. I want to say that of course it goes both ways. She reads mine, I read hers. But I remember once I was judging, it was the Boston Globe pen Winship contest that was for everything. So it was for fiction. Oh, it had to be a Massachusetts author. I think that was it. I forget. No, who knows what it was. But it was fiction and nonfiction and biography and memoir. And I called Stacy up and I said, what do you call a book that is just biography? Because, that's my source. That is just, then he went to school there, and then this was his roommate, and his father drove him. And, is explaining this dry biography, how much credit did I have? And she said, that's what we call a no value added biography. And I say to Stacy, when I introduced her that time, I said, it's things like, her first book was Antoine Saint-Exupéry, and he's playing the piano, and somehow she knew that oranges were on the keyboard rolling back and forth when he was playing. And I use that, and when I'm reading, because she's working, can I say what you're working on? A biography of Samuel Adams, that no one's written a biography of Samuel Adams before, correct?
There have been a few, but
yeah.
But not that we talk about tonight.
Who cares? But one of these facts will show up during the Boston Massacre, which I know now was never formally called the Boston Massacre, that was, historically labeled that. But, something about what somebody was carrying or what they were wearing. So I'm always evoking the Saint-Exupéry oranges and, what her real life characters ate.
What you're talking about is that same kind of fictional trick that when you say the food is very indicative of, the hostess who serves liver is telling us something about her character. I mean, what you're talking about is precisely the biographer using that same shorthand, right? When she's lucky enough to have the material at her fingertips.
Are we talking too much? It's 8:00. Is there another question that somebody wanted that I don't want to disappoint anyone?
Oh, I mean, I think you've both spoken marvelously about your sort of relationship, your professional relationship And we do have an attendee who's just curious what each of your favorite book of each other's is. I think that might be a really lovely note to end on.
Oh, but we never say stuff like that. Oh, I will say, okay, here's a reason. I got to tell, Vera won the Pulitzer, and by an odd collection of reasons, I got to tell Stacy that. Why? Because she was pregnant with her third child. I'm the godmother of that child, and she had to lie in the last trimester or the last few weeks on your left side. So I knew you were napping every afternoon, and my publicist, Brian McClendon, called and said, Ellie, did you hear? And I said, what? He said, Stacy won the Pulitzer. So I wasn't going to call and wake her up, but I wrote a fax. There was no email. I wrote her a fax, and I made fun, of course, of Brian Boyd, who was the biographer of Nabokov, who told Stacy, is this being very indiscreet? Like, there was no story there, and she wrote this book and won a Pulitzer. So about a half an hour later, I got a phone call, and it was Stacy saying, Ellie, what happened? And she thought maybe she knew because there was a phone call that she was supposed to call NPR. So maybe this Vera has a special place in my heart.
Even though I dedicated a different book to you, but that's okay.
Yeah, and so many of my books are dedicated to Stacy that I can't even name them.
Very sweet.
Well, it's lovely to hear you both talk about your relationship, and thank you both for being here for this lovely event about Rachel to the Rescue. It was a wonderful conversation, and just delightful to be able to join you. Thank you to our audience members as well for attending. I see from the chat that folks had a lovely time, and I'm so happy to be a part of this and to be able to provide that for folks. So again, thank you, Stacy and Eleanor, for being here, and I hope everybody has a wonderful night.
Oh, thank you. I loved being with both of you.
Congratulations,
and everyone. Thank you, Elle.
Thanks for joining us.
Okay.
Beautiful.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Have a great night, everyone.
Yeah.